very much. Okay, so thanks again then to Meg for the session so far. And what you've had a chance to do this morning, hopefully, is to reflect a little bit upon the impact of the classroom environment. So some really interesting discussion points you posted about the effective use of teaching assistants with a classroom, for example. And you've thought a little bit as well about differentiation in terms of curriculum content and pedagogy, and some really good points that you'd shared with Meg's survey in terms of potential benefits of differentiation, but also some of the challenges, for example, stigma and aspirations, which will fit in very well to Carmel's talk this afternoon. So what we're going to move on to talk about then for the final part of this session is to think a little bit about assessment. And I'm just going to refer back to one of the points somebody posted on the Padlet earlier on, which I thought was really interesting. In terms of differentiation, we do this a lot to support learners throughout their schooling. Then it gets to the end of school where they have uninclusive standardized examinations at the end, which seems to be a little bit of a waste in terms of all that work that's been put in place. So what we're going to think about then between now and break-in for the morning break is about assessment, in particular how assessment might create barriers for learners, including those with ALN, and also how assessment for learning, for example, may be used to support learners, including those with ALN. Excuse me. So for those of you that have had a chance to take a look at some of the materials on PLP, there was a resource from the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, looking at key actions for raising achievement guidance for teachers and leaders, for example, which offered a number of points and suggestions in relation to assessment, including potentially the importance of assessment being authentic in ensuring that there are skills, knowledge, understanding and approaches to assessment that will genuinely help learners to prepare for life and work. And they also highlighted that we need to remember that not only what we assess, but also to think about why we assess it, how we assess it, and what this information is subsequently used for. So going back to your kind of discussions about differentiation earlier on, learners differ in the way in which that they can best express what they know and evidence what they can do. And similar to consideration of the differentiated curriculum content and delivery with Meg this morning, there is also no single means of expression that will provide all learners with valid opportunities to demonstrate their learning. Therefore, we need to consider how we provide opportunities for all learners to demonstrate what they know and what they can do. And this may include supporting learning through appropriate formative assessment, as well as thinking about our more summative assessment of achievement. And we may also want to consider assessment in the sense of informing support and evaluating the impact of that support for learners amongst other purposes. So as well as ensuring that learners have the opportunity for appropriate assessment, we also need to consider the purpose of assessment. What is it we're assessing? Why are we assessing it that way? What is done as a result of the outcomes of those assessments? And if the purpose of assessment as suggested by Garfield 1994 is to support or enhance learning, then some 25 years ago now, the assessment reform group suggested that there is no evidence that increasing the amount of testing will enhance learning on its own. Wearmouth back in 2008 as well also talked about the impacts in particular of high stakes summative tests and how these might have negative impacts on students, such as upon their self-esteem, progression opportunities and life opportunities moving forward. However, as suggested by Earle 2013, if assessment is done right, then student achievement can be raised through assessment. So when we consider the purpose of assessment, we may be considering what is done with that data and for what purpose. And there needs to be consideration of what data is gathered. So is it just quantitative or quantifiable in some way? What do we do with more qualitative type assessment data? And consider that data can be used in a variety of ways. For example, considering learner progress and achievement, Or we could use it for assessing the effectiveness of teaching or an intervention. So linking back to the points that one of the groups shared a few moments ago about removing children from the classroom for intervention, for example. Kelly and Phillips back in 2011 talked about the golden rule of any intervention would be that the learner would engage with the intervention and make more progress than they would have done if they'd stayed in their everyday classroom doing their everyday activities. Otherwise, the logistics of that movement isn't really worth it to the learner, for example. Assessment may also be used in terms of organisation of aspects of the school, such as learner grouping that people have mentioned, which potentially we could spend a whole day of discussion just looking at that issue. And assessment could also involve monitoring and evaluating data throughout the learner's journey to ensure the best possible outcomes for them. So thinking in particular about formative as well as summative assessments. Arguably, with formative assessments, it's important to consider not just the how of assessment, but how do we ensure pupil engagement with appropriate feedback and feed forward to support the learner, or how can we also ensure that learners can engage through peer and self-assessments, for example. Assessment might also ensure consistency of capturing progress from a wide source of evidence. And assessment may support through helping to identify a wide range of quantitative and qualitative information demonstrating not just pupil progress, but also the pupil success and the impact of teaching and support and intervention. There are also, as suggests William 2011, distinctions between assessment of learning as well as assessment for learning, and we might also think about assessment as learning too. So thinking about assessment of learning, this involves looking at assessment information at the end of teaching and learning processes. We might use this to rank students' achievement levels against a particular standard. It tends to be summative in nature and typically involves standardised testing. Assessment of learning scores are often used to move students from one grade to another, thinking about their learning levels or in terms of results of specified achievement tests and the effectiveness of assessments or learning for grading. And it's important to consider, I suppose, that the validity and reliability of the tests can have a big impact. When we think about assessment for learning, this is an approach that tends to generate feedback that students can use to improve their performance. From a teacher's perspective, this could be as simple as observing class discussions. It could involve asking questions and reviewing students' work in progress. Assessment for learning is often immediate and informs changes that can be made to or during sessions straight away to make it more effective. For example, gathering feedback as to the nature of learner understanding or difficulties that they may be having dealing with the task, and is seen by Macmillan and Moore 2020 as being beneficial in that it may offer students some control over their learning, boost their motivation and support their metacognition, whilst for teachers it may offer an insight into levels of learner understanding during tasks. Assessment for learning may include initial or diagnostic assessment and formative assessment, be based on a variety of different information sources, for example, portfolios, works in progress, teacher observations, conversations, for example, and may provide both descriptive, verbal or written feedback that primarily emphasises student strengths, identifies challenges and points to the next steps to take, and may reflect a view of learning that helps students to learn better rather than just to achieve a better mark. And we could also think here of assessment as learning, which occurs, suggests early 2013, when students are their own assessors, when they when they monitor their own learning, when they ask questions and use a range of strategies to decide what they know and can do, and how to use assessment for new learning. Principles of assessment as learning approach may encourage students, therefore, to take responsibility for their own learning, provide ways for students to use formal and informal feedback to help them understand the next steps in their learning, encourage peer assessment, self-assessment and reflection, and occurs throughout that learning process rather than just at the end. However, we conceptualise and do assessment, though I think we can probably agree that assessment is a powerful process, and as a result, it can either optimise or inhibit learning depending upon how it's applied. So we're shortly going to go then into our final breakout activity for this morning session. And what we'd like you to do when you go back into your breakout rooms for the next 10 minutes or so is to share some key points from your discussions about your practices or practices within your setting in relation to assessment. So how do you do assessment of learning? How do you do assessment of learning? We'd also like you to think in terms of the assessment processes that you use. Are there any that in particular lead to barriers to learning? And how might these be overcome? But equally, thinking positively would also be really interesting to think about whether you use any types of assessment processes which potentially are facilitators of inclusion, and how might those assessment processes facilitating inclusion be further embedded or shared more widely. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen at this point. I have also posted the Padlet link into the